Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens with your host Jake. Today, Scott is coming back from vacation and he's got to work today. So sorry for you, Scott. I get to drink all the good whiskey. And today I said whiskey in particular because we are venturing across the pond to Scotland and we're going to be drinking Tamdhu. Gordon, did I say that correct?
You did, yeah. Beautiful.
All right, perfect. In the intro, I got it right. And we're going to be exploring all things Speyside. So let's sit back, dive in to this episode of the Bourbon Lens. So Gordon Dundas, who is the Advocacy Director, and he's got a longer, fancier title that we're going to skip because he knows I would mess it up, is here to join us today. So Gordon, how is things in Scotland right now?
Well, it's the middle of summer and it's raining. So, that's just the beauty of this place. Today's rain is tomorrow's whiskey and all that. So, it's not, we've not really had a summer yet, but things are good.
Yeah.
Life is good from our perspective within our business. Things are going well. So, yeah, it's good.
That's good. It's always great when things are looking up because, the more bottles you sell, the more whiskey you can make on the back end that people get to enjoy 12, 16, 18 years later. And so you and I were catching up before here. You actually have a little bit of history here in the great state of Kentucky, or the Commonwealth. Let me use the correct terminology.
I do. So
what's it like going from, being in Kentucky or being around Kentucky a little bit in the bourbon world and then going back into Scotch? How do you compare the two for the average listener that's like, oh, Scotch is all peated whiskey? It's not. Explain how they kind of work together, but are different.
Well, ultimately they're both whiskies, but as you quite rightly point out, what I love about bourbon, and I've been lucky enough to work in and around the bourbon industry, and then in it when I worked for Beam Suntory. So I represented Jim Beam and Maker's Mark. And I think one of the things from my perspective was my first ever tour when I worked for Whiskey Magazine back in the 2000s, probably 2008, something like that, maybe 7. I went to Kentucky for the first time and I had a tour around Maker's Mark with Mr. Pickerel, which if you're ever going to have a first tour around a distillery, he was a big character.
Yeah.
He poured big drams as well, to be fair. So it was fabulous. And from that point onwards, I was working for a whiskey magazine at that point. And as we were just saying, that's when there was probably 8, 9 distilleries only. And you can probably name them all the big brands that you would think of. I then went and spent some time with Jim Rutledge at Four Roses, explaining me the 5 yeasts and 2 recipes and all that sort of thing and why they do it and the diversity and how important yeast. So I got right into it and I totally understood it. But what I loved was the nuanced difference between the two. Coming from Scotland, we have the regionality, the history.
Yeah,
is the regionality is all related to the history of Scotch, and so there's a huge history in bourbon as well. But I love that. I love both aspects of it. I love the sweetness of bourbon. I love the subtlety of Scotch at times. So for me, it meshes all together.
Yeah.
What I would say as an observer a little bit more to the bourbon industry now is I'm struggling to. There's so many whiskeys.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you keep on top of it all? It's just like nuts, but
yeah,
great, but nuts.
No, I'm with you. And a lot of America has adopted the non-producing distiller, right? Where they are buying barrels, put their own label on it, or try to, revive a brand. So that's very difficult to kind of navigate, where a lot of the whiskey comes from one place, i.e. what happens in Irish whiskey from time to time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And, it is interesting. And the amount of distilleries, the sheer distilleries since 2010 to now is wild. My wife would rather me not keep up with as many of them as I do, because samples and bottles that show up and talk about them on the podcast. But, all in all, it's a lot of fun to explore. Regionality is starting to become a thing here. You're starting to see things pop up, but it's not quite like Scotland, right? Where you have traditional ways of making whiskey that goes back to the history. And you all call it on your label, Speyside single malt Scotch whiskey. So for the average bourbon consumer or whiskey consumer, they may not know what Speyside means. So can you explain that history and what that means and what you all are creating?
Yeah. Well, in a very simple sense, historically, and it's not so relevant now because you can make pretty much any style of whiskey in any part of Scotland now, pretty much. But historically, there were regions within Scotland. There still are regions. So we have Speyside, which is the region in the Highlands on the River Spey Valley, where there's the most amount of distilleries in Scotland, probably around about 60. So think of the big brands: Macallan, Glenfiddich, Glenlivet. Those types of distilleries are all in that area, and it's the biggest producing area of single malt. For blends, of course, we produce single malt for blend as well as for single malt, if you know what I mean. So that is the Speyside region. The other regions, very briefly, the biggest region with the most diverse historical taste profile is the Highlands. So anything from, Orkney all the way down to pretty much Glasgow. So, I mean, really big diversity of tastes. And then you have Campbelltown, which is a region which is really only 3 distilleries, but there was many, many more. Very distinctive style. That was, a lot of them were closed down, but there's three or four new distilleries planned in that region. The Lowlands, which we have a distillery in called Rosebank, a very famous Lowland distillery, which we've just reopened.
Yeah. So, okay, now I'm with that. Rosebank. I remember it was like first time in 99 years or something that place has been opened up.
No, it's been shut since 93.
93. Okay. So
we've rebuilt it on the same site, and it's a very famous, the King of the Lowlands, a very famous Lowland style, but a lighter style in a very general sense. The Lowland whiskies, I know we were just talking about Daft Milt as well. That's a Lowland whiskey as well. Lighter style generally. But again, and finally you have Islay. Islay is that island off the west coast of Scotland, which is known for its peaty whiskey. And so to say to all my bourbon friends, most Scotch whiskey is unpeated, just to tell you that.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, I think a lot of people are like, well, I love the sweetness of bourbon. Well, a lot of the flavor and the ability to avoid enzymes come from malt, right? And we put every bourbon has a malt characteristic, whether it's 1%, 10, 12%, whatever it may be. You need the enzymes, and it is a flavoring grain, right? And it has a bold, unique flavor that I think most bourbon people miss out on because that maltiness carries such flavor and complexity along with it. And as it ages, it does a lot of variety of things. So for you all at Tamdhu, traditional pot distilled?
Well, obviously single malt must be pot distilled. We can only distill in single pot. You can only distill in pot stills to make single malt. Not the case for our grain whiskey, which you would then combine with single malt to make a blend, such as Johnny Walker. So all single malt distilleries are always pot stills. Generally double distilled in Scotland, but occasionally, Rosebank being one of them, triple distilled.
Okay.
So pretty rare in Scotland. Really, only 2 distilleries doing it full time. But they're both in the Lowland region. But yeah, pot stills, 100% malted barley. We don't have a mash bill. It's just 100% malted barley for a single malt.
Yeah.
And yeast, water.
Yeah.
Obviously. Same setup.
And so as you all distill, right, and you go through that, what type of pot are you all using? Is it a Carl pot?
Well,
is it a...
this is the big thing that I think where we start to drive a little bit of difference between bourbon and Scotch. So if you look at certain distilleries in, you look at Woodford Reserve as a triple pot distilled whiskey. That's a bit of an outlier in bourbon. It's a bit different.
Yep.
In Scotland, we're all doing pot stills. We're all using 100% malted barley. But our nuances come through the way that we produce even from the mashing part through fermentation through distillation.
Yeah.
The big thing about Scotch and why there's that diversity is 2 things. Obviously, whether you use peat or not use peat, but secondly, the pot stills are that way of defining that spirit that you will set up in the fermentation and set up in mashing. So if you have very tall pot stills, you're generally going to get a lighter style spirit. I'm speaking very generally here.
For sure.
If you have shorter pot stills, you'll get a heavier spirit. The other thing, of course, is the temperatures of distillation. So, we know the boiling point of alcohol. I know what it is in degrees C. I think it's about 180 Fahrenheit. And And if you then heat to 180 degrees Fahrenheit and you leave it, you're going to vaporize slowly. You're going to let those copper pot still shapes really start to benefit what you're trying to achieve in your spirit. So if you're looking for fruitiness, you want those lighter vapors to go over into the condenser, not the heavy ones.
Yeah.
And if you're trying to make a different style of whiskey, potentially a peated style of whiskey, you'll distill in a different way because you want to retain those phenols that you put into the barley at the very beginning, historically. So there's a whole, the nuances of distillation are really important, but also how you set that up in fermentation, and how you set that up in the process before, of course, with mashing. So ultimately, the shape of the pot stills, I could take you to 10 different distilleries in Scotland, single malt distilleries. They'd all have different shaped pot stills.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now that's where you get that beautiful diversity of style.
Yeah.
Add in peat, lots of peat, a little bit of peat, no peat. You start to get that, and then add in all the different casks that you can use to mature, and you have this cornucopia of flavors and taste.
Well, and I think that's the cool thing, right? Because here, 99% of it's giant column stills, and you're just trying to get the cleanest whiskey you can, because we're going to extract much more out of our barrel aging process, because the temperatures are going to be a little bit more radical, where you're kind of more mild traditionally. And you all are aging in used cooperage. We're aging in new cooperage, right? So the barrel extraction is a lot more, and you all can use a barrel multiple times over. It doesn't just have to be a once used; it could be a 10 times used.
And refill in Scotland is crucial. It's the widest used type of cask because you get that lovely balance. You want that spirit character to shine through. So if I took you to those 10 distilleries and I sat each distiller down and I said to them, or we said to them, what's your favorite type of cask? A lot of them would go refill, because it's going to showcase that spirit character. So if you take, for example, our single malt, our 12-year-old Tamdhu, we've got a lovely amount of refill casks in there. But the one thing that makes Tamdhu completely different to every other single malt whiskey in that cornucopia of flavor that I've just spoken about, it's 100% Oloroso sherry casks from Spain. They've all come from Spain.
Well,
that makes us different. We don't use bourbon casks. We do not use casks that have come from America. We use American oak sherry casks, but they're made in Spain. The American oak comes from America, but we do not use that 200-liter charred bourbon barrel that's held Jack Daniels or Jim Beam for 4 to 6 years. They're great, not a criticism at all.
Nope.
We just use sherry. That was our owner's decision when he stepped into the distillery, when he bought it from the Edrington Group, who owned Macallan, in 2011. He looked at the stocks. There was beautiful sherry casks. And he said, let's just make sherry cask whiskey, 100% Oloroso sherry cask.
That's really interesting, because on the, as I kind of walked through this whiskey myself, it's really, I would say it's lighter in the fruitiness, right? It's a lot of crisp apple, vanilla, a little light oak, pepper, like on the nose. It was just a really nice, easy drinking whiskey. This is 86 proof, 43% ABV. And then what's really nice, I think, about this whiskey is on the palate, the caramel opens up. And that was the thing that I liked, is there was this whole jump of flavor in the palate. And then as I go back to smell it, I don't know if they have this in Scotland, but it was almost caramel corny, right? Like where it's got caramel corn and it's like Cracker Jacks almost. Like that's what the back end of the glass smells like. And this is, even though it's sherry finished, or sherry barrels, I think this is a bourbon drinker's type of scotch, because of the flavor characteristics can match up really nicely.
For sure. Absolutely. Because we're actually using quite a bit of American oak here. So an American oak sherry cask generates a very different style of whiskey than a European oak sherry cask. And just to be clear, everything we make in this 12-year-old whiskey, or a 15-year-old or 18, everything is fully matured from start to finish. So what's really interesting about that is you're tying these sherry casks, which are very expensive. They are 10 times more expensive than a bourbon cask. They're handmade in Spain. They take 6 years to make. They're probably $1,500 each. It just shows you. So we're tying those casks up for the full term, for 12 years in these whiskeys. And that's because we want to still have an elegance and style that comes through. So they're not finished; they're fully matured, and you start to see as we go through the range, we'll see how we change the ratios of American oak to European oak as we go to the 15 and then the 18, and those taste profiles just change. It's amazing how they change over those two expressions. So, to just do 100% sherry cask was we're a family-run Scotch whisky business, and that was a family decision. Let's just do 100% Oloroso sherry cask, which means that we have our volume aspirations go down.
Yeah.
Because you can only buy so many sherry casks. And we were very lucky because we bought Glengoyne, which is another distillery that we own, and we bought Tamdhu. Both of them, we bought them from the Edrington Group, who own Macallan. And as part of that relationship over 20 years, we buy the same sherry casks. Okay.
Well, then that's nice. At least you know the maker. And
maker, you know the people.
Yeah.
They deliver the quality. So, yeah.
Well,
and yeah.
Oh, and say, well, that's one thing I think that's consistent across whiskey is it's a family, right? Like, yes, you're in competition with people, but opening up doors for other distilleries or continuing upon those relationships are something that you see worldwide. It's not like, oh, hey, we hate them. No, you actually kind of lean in, or hey, you purchase from there, and now we're gonna like let you in on this relationship too, right? Like that's the one thing I really enjoy about whiskey is the camaraderie amongst competition.
Totally, and we must ensure we keep that because, in Scotland, if you look at Scotland, there's been whiskey. There's been whiskey moving around Scotland for years. So Ian MacLeod started off as a broker.
Yeah.
We weren't a producer. We started off in 1933. We were a broker. We were the people between Diageo and Pernod Ricard, for example, going, you want some of that? You want some of that? We'll do the deal for you. And that was our history. That was our sort of way into the industry. And then we ultimately went through many different parts till we became a producer when we bought Glengoyne. Tamdhu gave us more volume. It's a 4 million litre distillery on Speyside, but we only put 15% of that into sherry casks because we can only buy so many sherry casks. But 500,000 litres a year is not insignificant in terms of the amount of bottles you'll get in 10 years. So, but so we use that remaining 3.5 million for other things that we need to produce.
Yeah. Well, you got to be able to produce a lot of things, exactly. Right? And, exactly. And what's also big in Scotch, like we're not talking about it today, but is blended whiskey, right? Like that's a big part of it. Most brands have a blended whiskey on the marketplace, and
we do.
That's the great part of it. So we walked through the 12, which what I consider a nice, delicate, easily balanced whiskey.
Yep.
At 12 years, what's the SRP on this? Traditionally,
it's about $65 a bottle.
Okay, so it's going to be right in the Macallan, Glenfiddich, like kind of range.
It's probably a little bit more than Glenfiddich and a little bit less than Macallan.
Yeah, so right in your kind of sweet spot for 12-year-old Scotch.
Yeah, beautiful bottle presented. I mean, the bottle's beautiful. It's a Victoriana bottle. The bottle's 1897. You don't have it there, but we've got this beautiful shaped bottle.
That's a very nice looking bottle.
Yeah, it's just because it's only an 1897 distillery. It's not very old. Many distilleries are a lot older than that.
Yep.
But it's really just to celebrate that Victoriana that the distillery was built in.
Yeah.
But whenever you see that unique shaped Tamdhu bottle, 100% sherry casks. And I've got some visual things which are not going to work so well on a podcast, but I can explain.
Don't you worry. I recorded the audio or the video on this one today to be able to maybe cut up some clips. Colin, surprise, doing some YouTube stuff. So feel free to use the visual aids. We're gonna try. We're venturing.
The one thing I want to talk about is the differences in sherry cask.
All right, let's talk about it.
A sherry cask is not just a sherry cask. I mentioned we use American oak and European oak. I want to show you that in a very visual sense. And I'm going to hold these up.
Oh, boy.
Now, if I said to you, which is the oldest, I guess you'd probably go this one.
Correct. Like just by visual color.
Yeah,
now,
and most people would.
But because you said that, I'm going to say the other one.
It is pretty much the other one. Yeah, this is older. But if you look at this, that just shows you the difference between American oak. This is American oak sherry cask, and this is a European oak sherry cask. And so you're going to get hugely different flavors. Why are they different in color? Much darker European oak. You extract a lot more. It's a more open oak.
Yep.
And when you make a sherry cask, you're toasting that oak at a much lower temperature than you are a bourbon barrel. So it's like putting bread in a toaster rather than using a blowtorch on a bit of bread, which is a good analogy. So that's the sort of difference. And so when you then leave it to mature in that European oak, you start to suck out tannins and darker compounds that give you this rich, dark flavor. Whereas American oak, we still have that sort of vanilla because, of course, there's vanillin in American oak, but we get a lot of other sort of flavors such as stone fruits and peaches and those types of things. Not the same as a bourbon cask because there's obviously, a few other reasons why, but in a very simple way, you still get a hint of those flavors from a bourbon style maturation. So when you come to our 15-year-old, we're combining more European oak and into that sort of marriage for that 15-year-old, and you see that richness coming through in the taste and on the nose.
So that's what I was about to ask you. So you're supposed to lead me through this tasting versus me leading you, but let me give you my general impressions and see if this is kind of what you would get, from your point of view. So as I nose this, the first thing I know, and I know about European oak because I love French oak. I think French oak is just a really beautiful wood. It's a little bit more perfumey, so that bouquet is going to kind of wake your nose up right in the front. And the Oloroso starts to shine a little bit more on this because, again, I think that extraction gets into there. So that sherry and then comes out. So I'm getting a little bit more of that, I'll say plum kind of note or fig that kind of comes through versus the vanilla. So this is more of that like richer, darker flavor on the nose than on the 12-year.
And that is that richer, darker flavor is actually not coming from the sherry per se. It's coming from the European oak.
Okay.
So it's the European oak that's extracting more, that's giving us those darker colors. That's a 10-year-old whiskey, by the way.
Wow.
So that just shows you what you can get from European oak after 10 years. So we're combining that at 15, as it were, with this at 15, which this is about 15. And we combine them together. So that European oak that's delivering that richer, darker profile of darker raisins, darker plums, even a bit of nuttiness, and the sweetness moving further in the back of the palate. That's what we have amplified in the 15 compared to the 12. And then we do the same again in the 18.
So the nuttiness was a characteristic that kind of gives me a little Jim Beam vibes, to be honest, going back to a call back to your old days there. Because they're traditional with a nutty profile. This has that nuttiness characteristic on the nose. And then as you go to the palate, I mean, the palate couldn't be too night and day different between the 12 and the 15. This is a little bit more drying. I think French traditionally, or the European oak traditionally has more drying characteristics, more tannin. But that nuttiness and that plum, that those richer flavors carry over, and then that nuttiness kind of lingers in the back end. It's like macadamia nut, really, kind of is what I'm getting.
Absolutely,
really beautiful.
No, and so if somebody said to me, out of the 12, the 15, and the 18, which one would you choose to give the best representation of Tamdhu? I would pick the 15. I think you've still got a nice amount of spirit character in there. There's a good amount of refill cask, but there's more European oak driving a richer flavor. We've upped the percentage to 46, so it's 92 proof. And we are, we've got that sweetness. I find a little bit at the front when you taste it initially comes from that American oak element in here. And then that swell of richness from the European oak, beautifully smooth. The thing that strikes me with Tamdhu, even at 46%, just so smooth.
And this is, and I've never been into like the Scotch cocktail category. Mm-hmm. This whiskey in particular, probably around $100, maybe a little bit more expensive than that.
It's about 120.
Okay, 120. So not bad, really, for a 15-year-old whiskey. I mean,
no, fully matured in cherry.
Yeah, exactly. Like, so you're getting a double whammy. This could be a great cocktail whiskey too, because it's got those dark complex flavors. So when you add something to it, it's going to brighten it up. It's going to bring it up. Mm-hmm. Now, I wouldn't do that because I really think that this is just an enjoyable Scotch. But, if you wanted to take something out of this, man, this would be kind of where it is. Like,
oh, no. I mean, we don't do a lot of cocktails. We've done some great cocktails with it because you have the strength as well at 46 to deliver that punch as well, more than the 12. And I think those robust flavors from the European oak also come through a little bit more and enable you to, you could use that Scotch as a replacement for a bourbon in a classic cocktail.
Yeah.
You could absolutely do that.
I mean, that's really good.
It's really good.
Like,
That's really good.
Oh man.
There's a lovely thick mouthfeel. When you mature in European oak, you get a thicker whiskey because it's extracting more from the oaks. It's thick.
Yep.
American oak a little bit thinner. American oak sherry, and then an ex-bourbon cask matured whiskey in Scotland will probably be the thinnest.
Yeah.
Not suggesting that's inferior. I'm just saying in terms of the bourbon matured whiskey is. I'm a big fan of bourbon matured Scotch whiskey, so it is not a slight on that at all. I'm just saying that as you go through, thickness in whiskey, you won't get much thicker than from a European oak sherry cask.
Well, and I like that it's tannic, not oily, right? So when you talk about it's like a chewy whiskey is like how I would, you munch on this and you're going to get a lot of flavors. Like the back end, there's this nice chocolate note that kind of lingers with you that I am really, really enjoying. And this is a versatile pour year round. Like this is a pour you could have sprinter, winter, spring, summer, and fall, right? Very easily at 92.
No, you could drink and also work after dinner as well.
Yeah.
It would, there's plenty of other things that would, and you can add ice to it as well. I mean, let's face it, that's going to work well with some ice. So, for me, the 15 is great. And then as we go on, we have the 18, which takes us more down that European oak route, which we'll come on to. But, we really have, and the big thing is, we've only owned Tamdhu for about 11 and a half years. So that 12, 15 and 18 were laid down by the previous owners, which was Edrington. So that's why it's important for us to buy the same casks, keep the spirit the same. And that's what we're doing. So we're nearly on to a Ian MacLeod 12-year-old, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
Really exciting.
So now we go into the 18, right? So we bumped up the European oak in the last one quite a bit. How much does the bump come in 18?
70% first fill European oak.
Wow.
In an 18-year-old whiskey. So 70% of those casks that we marry together and bring together after 18 years, remember, these are not finished, these are fully matured.
Yeah.
Are 18-year-old first fill sherry butts predominantly. So 500-liter casks, been maturing for 18 years. That's how we make this whiskey. So we don't make lots of it. We don't have lots of it. We're near the top of our stock levels at the moment. But that's how we. So 70% first fill, very little American oak, pretty much no American oak. Maybe, very little, 2%, 1%. That remaining sort of 29%, 20 is all refills. So that refill is important. Less color from the cask over 18 years, but you're going to see that spirit change over those 18 years in a cold warehouse in Scotland.
Yeah.
And that's why refill is so important.
Man, because the nose completely changes from the 15 to the 18 again.
Yep, totally. The nose is now rich, it's dark, it's 46.8, so it's a little stronger. The color is hugely darker. The color is that sort of color, a little bit lighter than that. I've only got a tiny little bit of 18 here. But what you notice with this is your decadent after dinner whiskey. It's not I wouldn't call it a sherry bomb, which is a phrase many people would use for certain types of sherry cask. It's elegant, but it's rich. It's not overpowered. It's not over matured. There's a beautiful balance to it.
Yeah. And so this one is probably going into the $300 range for this whiskey.
No, it's 199, 210.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 199, 210, 220, something like
that. That's a steal, to be honest.
It's an absolute steal for an eight. I mean, you'll pay a lot. You'll pay less for other products. You'll pay more for other products.
Yeah.
But for an 18-year-old at 46.8% alcohol, with that, I think it's a brilliant product at that price point.
And what I find really interesting about this is, so we've gone from like a crisp apple in the 12, we've gone to more like a juicy apple in the 15. The 18, we've moved to pear almost. It's like the orchard fruit has continually shifted. So like that underlying alcohol and fermentation note that's kind of been consistent across has the flavors have changed in that. And so that's what I find really interesting, because again, you do get the more sherry, the darker, richer notes. But I kind of was like trying to find that consistency across distillation paths, and that's weird that the orchard fruit has changed just slightly over the time, and that's really interesting.
And that's really important that you pick that up, because that is Tamdhu. That is, that's what we want. We don't just want cask. We want to see that fruit. It's very fruity spirit. We do it Tamdhu, very fruity. So we use a yeast that particularly promotes a fruity style. We create a clear wort after our mashing. That's really important. That pushes you down that style. Whereas if you wanted to produce a heavily peated whiskey, you would have what we would call a cloudy wort. That's retaining more of that phenols all the way through the process. So we want to see that. We want to see that character shining through. We just don't want to taste cask, and that's really, really important. Then the other thing you notice, and you'll know this as a bourbon fan, me too. You drink a bourbon, you get that taste right on the front of your lips.
Yeah,
it's all here because of the corn spirit, an American oak. Sweetness is at the front generally, and this is right at the back.
Yeah, mid to back palate.
It's not activating on the front of the tongue. It's activating at the back of the tongue. It's like the difference between sort of milk and dark chocolate.
Yeah.
Milk chocolate's at the front, dark chocolate's at the back. There's a little bit of that. And that's European oak will drive you to the back because it's just, that's one of the differences I pick up.
That's a really good way to talk about it. I think I feel like sometimes we should have like a diagram of the tongue always and be like front palate, mid palate, back palate, finish.
Salt at the side.
Exactly. Like this has a little bit of salinity to it. So I'm glad you said salt, because like I do get a little salinity. My saliva glands are a little bit more working harder.
Tannin.
Yeah.
Probably the tannin, just in a different form. That's what a lot of people say to me, I get a scent of, and there is obviously not salt in it. We know that, and it's nowhere near the sea, but it's probably just the tannins coming through. But it's a fabulous whiskey. If you like a cigar, great whiskey. We do one called Cigar Malt, which is a sort of very limited release, which is 100% first fill sherry. But this is a great whiskey. It's never going to be in every whiskey shop. You're going to need to find it a little bit, but you will find it if you want to.
Well, and I think that's the fun of Scotch, right? Is all the limited stuff is not always going to be available everywhere. But if you go into a really nice shop that has really good whiskey, you're probably going to find Tamdhu along with the rest of them. Mm-hmm. But I have to agree with you. That 15 is a representation.
Yeah.
It's what I think of fully matured Scotch. Like it's full of flavor, depth of flavor, changed over time. Now, is the 18 a brilliant whiskey? Of course it is. Is the 12 a brilliant whiskey? Yes. But like that 15, after going through it,
I agree.
I'm with you 100% agreement.
So for me, I try and describe it this way. The 15 has width. It's with the flavor. It's got a different, and it's all sort of front and mid palate. There's a bit of richness coming in the back. What the 18 is driving you down a little bit more of a sort of tunnel of taste that drives straight, and it's not, and they're both great. They are both great. And if you are not sitting at 10:30, or sitting in the morning, and you were sitting late at night in a leather wingback chair, having had a lovely dinner, maybe a cigar if you do that type of thing, and a pile of 80% Lindt dark chocolate, the Tamdhu 18 is the whiskey you're going to want.
Oh, 100%. You get,
but the 15 has, if somebody says to me, I've never had Tamdhu before, which one should I have? I would actually pour them the 15.
Yeah. And it's really great. Now, we're not going to taste through any more whiskey, but as far as the range goes, do you have anything above the 18? Do you get into the 21 or 25-year-old category as well?
We don't have any whiskey at that level. We have some older whiskey, which you may hear about in the coming weeks and years and whatever, which is significantly older, but of our general stock, we are at about 20 and a half years old at the moment.
Okay.
So next year, there may be a 21. In fact, there will be a 21. That's going to be pretty limited, but there will be a 21. And in terms of our range, we have, and I'm going to do it more in a style. We have at one end, we have a fully matured and American oak whiskey, which is called Quercus alba Distinction. So that's a sherry cask.
Did you just put a spell on me, Harry Potter?
Pretty much.
Yeah. Okay. Just making sure.
Yes, it's 100% American oak matured Quercus alba Distinction, 48%. That's what it's called. Now that as a whiskey, and I was over in the States recently. We were doing a little bit of tastings in one or two stores in Florida. And I was getting bourbon drinkers to go mad about that. They loved that whiskey because it's American oak. So that there's a bit of that element in it. 48% of strength. And they love the thickness and the flavor of it. That sits in terms of purely taste to a slightly lighter style of the 12.
Okay. Then
you have the 12, the 15, the 18 as we've gone through. And then at the far end, we have a whiskey called the Cigar Malt, which is about $350. And it's 53.8%, and it's all first fill sherry. So it's that sort of color. So that's the range as we see it. There's also a high strength one, which we do, which is called the batch strength. It's around about 58% alcohol.
Okay.
And sits between the 12 and 15 in terms of its cask makeup. So quite a bit of American oak in those ones, but brilliant range of whiskey. We have a bit of everything for everybody.
Well, and I like that. And I think that's one of the things I've noticed a lot more about Scotch in general, as I keep an eye on it, is the full strength, cask strength, whatever you want to call it, batch strength. That's starting to come out more to appeal to the American consumer, because the American whiskey consumer has proofed up, right? Most American whiskeys that are being sold here, it's still going to be 80 proof. Like that's going to be the majority of it. But as the enthusiast and as the category continues to grow, 90 to 100 proof is higher. And that's where people are kind of sitting, especially in the cocktail renaissance that we live in. And so that's the one thing I've really enjoyed, is seeing Scotch appeal to the American whiskey drinker in a way of more proof.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think, even in the whiskies we've got there, also I find when you add more European oak, it appears more intense, and you get that intensity that comes through because the alcohol's pushing those flavors forward. It's not, you're not actually taking, and that's what really comes through. So, I think the other thing that's really important to, just touch on, and I'm happy to share a video with you, and you could share it with people, is just trying to explain to people what actually a sherry cask is, because sherry casks are all made in Spain. Sherry comes from the Sherry Triangle, as we know, within Jerez and in that small area. But a modern day sherry cask is made for the Scotch whiskey industry.
Yeah,
it's a cask that's air dried. The wood is air dried, whether that's American oak or European oak. Can be 2 years of air drying. That means we're going to get the best flavors. It's then toasted on the inside. This is a big difference between sherry casks and bourbon casks. Bourbon casks generally charred violently for generally about a minute.
Yeah,
can be less. That's one of the variables you could argue you have within bourbon to deliver different flavors, and
for sure,
rack house positions and all the things that we know. But generally in a sherry cask, and our ones, I can only talk about ours, 30 to 40 minutes of toasting at a much lower temperature. That opens up the oak, and then that Oloroso, which is made for the Scotch whiskey industry, specified by us, is put into there, and it seasons that oak for 2 years. And so it takes, from a tree being cut down to the cask arriving in Scotland, it's 6 years, pretty much 6 years.
Wow.
So you can't phone up a sherry cask producer or a sherry cask cooperage in Spain and go, "Can I have 200 sherry casks?" They'll go, "No." They're basically hedged out. They're working with people all the way through. They can't make any more.
Wow.
And that comes down to actually the sustainability of the oak as well. That's the big problem. A lot of people go, "Not enough people drink sherry." Well, if we're honest, the sherry's made for us.
Yeah.
So they can make more sherry. it's the oak is one of the challenges. European oak and even American oak's under more strain than it ever has been, but there's still good oak out there. But there's more people wanting bourbon casks. There's more people wanting everything around the world. So the oak, in a very general sense, has been the main driver to why cask prices have gone up.
Yeah, no, I think that is 100% correct. And it's really cool that a lot of people have gotten into sustainability to help figure out the oak issue, not just in the States, but worldwide. And that will allow for preservation of the great whiskey that you all are making and we're making here in the States. So, that is a great representation. Yeah. And if people have never seen a sherry butt, just go Google it. It's huge. It's like, they're not small things.
It's 500 liters.
It's a lot of whiskey.
It's a lot of whiskey, and this is another thing. This is the other thing. You mature people talk about age and they look at whiskeys and they'll go, it's a 15-year-old, that's a 15-year-old. Absolutely. They're both 15 years old.
Yep.
But if you've matured one in a 200-liter bourbon cask, you're going to get a beautiful style. You're going to get vanilla. You're going to get the spirit character, some refills in there. It's going to be lighter in color. 200 liters. So you've got a certain spirit to wood ratio. Sherry butt. Completely different cask, completely different oak type, 2.5 times bigger. You're going to get a very different whiskey in a sherry butt. And so understanding what cask your whiskey's matured in, which is less important in bourbon, obviously, because they're all generally the same.
Yep.
Understanding a sherry cask or what type of sherry bourbon that'll give you a little indication of what you can expect, obviously, on the palate in terms of the cask interaction. So
definitely. Well,
yeah, I've got a little video that I'd love to share with you if you could share it out.
Yeah.
I'm just going to I'll send a link in the chat.
But yeah, definitely send it over. We'll definitely share it out when this comes live, whatever I do with it, because I'm going to do something fun with it, because this has been a great conversation. And I literally just sent our Discord group at Bourbon Lens Patreon a note saying everyone needs to go buy Tamdhu whiskey. So just to let you know, I did my part to share that out already.
No, thank you. Well, we're doing a lot with our route to market at the moment in the States, which is good. So people will be able to find it a little bit more in the coming months, which is really exciting. Depending on your states, we're working with different people in different states, but it's going to be out there a little bit more. Well,
and the last thing we like to do here on the podcast is let you share with our listeners where people can go find out more about Tamdhu and how they can get a hold of whiskey or find the whiskey.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly the first thing to do, if you're interested, tamdhu.com will tell you a little bit more about what we do. Follow us on socials, of course. We do videos and content, and we're going to do more of that for the US market. As I said, we've got some great content on what a sherry cask is, a very honest appraisal of what a sherry cask is. It's not a distillery you can visit. We're not open to the public. We'd rather buy sherry casks at the moment and mature our whiskey than but it's certainly, we're a family-owned business. So we actually have 3 distilleries in Scotland. We've got Glengoyne, we've got Tamdhu, we've got Rosebank, which we spoke about, that very famous lowland whiskey that's just been reborn. So we have a distillery in India because we've had a business in India for a long time. So we have a single malt distillery in India. So we might be discussing an Indian single malt in a couple of years. And we're building a distillery on Islay. So we'll have a smoky, peaty one. So there's a lot what we do, but we're a family business at the heart of it. And certainly tamdhu.com, join the Dedication Society, find out more about what we do. It's all on the website. So that's where I would go.
All right. I like that. And Indian single malt, here for it, by the way. And so with that, I always like to let our Scottish friends kind of finish us out on a toast because you all have the best toast. I don't as an American. So would you mind leading us out on a toast?
Yeah. So I mean, I've got a little bit of 15 here.
Don't you worry, I poured more 15 as well.
Good. Really, just to say, guys, enjoy whiskey wherever it comes from, but broaden those horizons.
Yeah.
Drink different stuff. Try things. If you're a big bourbon fan, go and try a Scotch. If you're a big Scotch fan, go and try a bourbon. We should all just drink it because wherever it comes from, in a very general sense, the quality of whiskey from around the world is better than it's ever been. And just enjoy it. So as we say in Scotland, Slanjiva.
Slanjiva.
And drink Tamdhu, obviously.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bourbon Lens. Make sure you're connected with Scott and I via social media on Instagram, X, and Facebook. We'd love to connect. And if you're more the professional type, follow us over on LinkedIn. If you want to know more about Bourbon Lens, make sure you're subscribed to our weekly newsletter, The Weekly Pour. For exclusive content and more, check out Patreon. Follow us there at Bourbon Lens. And last but not least, on your favorite podcast listening app, make sure you're subscribed because every Monday, Scott and I release a podcast, and we would love to have you here listening to the newest features and the newest whiskey news. And until next time, cheers.